Hi everyone, Professor King here. In this video, I'll be talking about Friedrich Nietzsche's On Truth and Lying in a Non-Moral Sense. Some of you, if you were looking it online, may have found it in a slightly different title because Nietzsche is being translated from the German. There are words that are like close approximations. So you may have seen it as On Truth and Falsity in a non-moral sense, or in an extra-moral sense, or in an ultra-moral sense. I've seen all of those are the same reading. Again, they're just translations from the German. So sometimes you'll see this title in English slightly differently depending on where you come across it. So I'm really excited. I hope you like this one because I do. But I want to dive right in and make sure that we are getting Nietzsche. I feel like Nietzsche might be one of the slightly more accessible ones we've been reading in these first few weeks, I hope. I think the intro to this reading is absolutely hysterical, and I hope you did too. But without further ado, let's just kind of jump into the PowerPoint and discussing Nietzsche and kind of unpacking this stuff as much as we can so that we can prepare for our discussion boards. And yeah, so I'll just go right into the share screen and to PowerPoint and the slideshow. All right, so again, like I said, this is On Truth and Lying in a Non-Moral Sense by Friedrich Nietzsche. What do we mean by truth and lying in a non-moral sense? Well, in the same way that Foucault is not interested with not interested in saying like, oh, power, you are so bad, or oh, sexual perverts, you are just wacky, right? Like they're not concerned with sort of pushing their morality onto their subject matter. They're really looking at it conceptually, theoretically, and in a way that's fresh and new, right? So with Nietzsche, Nietzsche is saying, I'm looking at the notions of truth and of lying, but without this sort of baggage of like, whether it's good or bad to be honest or deceptive or whatever, right? Like he's not concerned with that kind of truth and lying or that kind of truth and falsity. What Nietzsche is concerned with is really like, where does this come from? And how are our conceptions of these concepts, how are our notions of these concepts just so whacked out, right? Like, even though we think they're totally normal. So let's talk a little bit about what that means and kind of where we see that. So Nietzsche, he's got all these great quotes. It's like listening to a really cool song. Like you just want to memorize all these quotes so you can like write them in your journal or something. Or maybe that's just me because I'm an old dork. But anyway, one of the things Nietzsche says, when he starts off, and I love, he starts off with this hilarious, just dripping with sarcasm and cynicism couple of sentences, right? In some remote corner of the universe, flickering in the light of the countless solar systems into which it had been poured, there was once a planet on which clever animals invented cognition. It was the most arrogant and most mendacious minute in the history of the world, but a minute was all it was. It's just like, he's just like, gosh, people are stupid. Like, I don't think Nietzsche is praised for his sarcasm and his cynical wit as much as he should be. I think a lot of people misconstrue some of that for like seriousness, but clearly like he's cracking himself up, right? And in this beginning part, he says, what do human beings really know about themselves? What do we know about ourselves? Where can the drive to truth, this unwavering need to know truth, right? Where is this coming from? And I honestly, guys, I feel like if we can read some of this Nietzsche and really think about what he's saying about, is there such a thing as truth with a capital T when it comes to us? I'll try and get in the light a little bit better for you guys. Or is it just all a bunch of hooey because of how we've formulated our concept of truth? then we can, I mean, this has lasting implications, right? Of how we see the world, of how we see politics. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I see people believing information that is just like, really? Like, really, you're going to go to QAnon and believe that, like, you know, like what Alex Jones says about lesbians being like, you know, brain eating baby sacrificers is true, right? Like, you guys really believe that? Like, it kind of blows my mind sometimes. But if we think about where this notion of truth came from, and how, you know, in Nietzsche's estimation, how arrogant we as sort of an animal species are, um, we can start to unpack some of that maybe. So the first thing Nietzsche gets to is like this idea that our cognition is deceptive. Just in its purest form, cognition is deception, right? Why? Well, we operate through concealment and dissimulation. And by dissimulation, he's really talking about pretense. And this pretense comes as sort of a byproduct of the arrogance of humankind. And when he says arrogance, he means like, why do we think that we are, you know, the greatest animal species? Why do we think we're the center of the universe? Why do we think that things have, you know, a distinct nature in and of themselves because we call it so? You know, all of that is our own arrogant self-deception. Well, why? Why, right? Because when we look at something that's occurring naturally in the world, we have to assign meaning to it. We have to classify it. He calls it metaphor. Really what he's talking about is like literally applying words to things, right? We apply translation, but all of that is arbitrary. The meaning, and by the time we get to what we consider to be the meaning of the thing, right? The essence of the thing, we're lost, we're gone, because that word that we created to define this thing has probably now changed over time or has been reinterpreted. It's like this millennial long game of telephone, essentially, right? And so if we assigned meaning that was arbitrary to this thing in the first place, and then that meaning has changed over time, then that meaning is meaningless, right? Like, it kind of is a little heady. So again, if you need to pause to kind of let this stuff really filter through, do it. You know, and he says a big chunk of this is our need to sort of make patterns out of chaos, essentially. He doesn't say that verbatim, but, you know, we have this propensity to define and classify items, right? And some of the ways we do this is by ignoring variance and variety, right? Overlooking within any given group what is individual and real, right? So like, look at this photograph here. And I just want to ask you, right, in a very tongue-in-cheek way, what is this a photograph of? Clearly in your head, you're going, well, it's a photograph of tomatoes, right? But look at them. They're all different. Some of them are cut in half. There's a bunch of different varieties, right? And so that leads to further classification. Well, one's an heirloom and one's a Roma and one's a, you know, whatever else, steak tomato, right? But even within these smaller and smaller classifications, there's something that we're overlooking that makes us force this thing to be part of the group, right? Like maybe some of you order imperfect produce and you'll get an heirloom tomato that looks like, you know, a kumquat, because it looks like a kumquat, but it tastes like an heirloom tomato. What is it? You know, like this undying need to classify things is where we start to deceive ourselves. And then we also have to set things apart from what they're not, right? So like if you've ever played the game 20Q, 20 questions, you know, it always starts off with animal, mineral, or vegetable. And what it's doing is, if let's say you say vegetable, right? What it's doing is then it's taking this subset of items, right? There's millions of them, millions of things that are not animal or mineral, right? But it's separating that subset and getting rid of, right, the things that are not, right? And then we keep asking questions until we get to what the thing is. And the fun part is always kind of stumping the 20Q where they didn't get the thing you were saying it was, but whatever, right? That's an example of our need to classify, and sometimes it comes out wrong, right? There's this slippage or this imperfection, right, to this desire to create reality as we know it, because reality is a chaotic, messy, slippery place. Another way that we define and classify items is by creating schema. And schema are essentially concepts or ways of ordering our perception of the world, right? So like, you know, if we think about like a home, the notion of home is a schema, right? Because for some of us that means, you know, pets and families. For some of us that means, you know, intimate partner that we're not married to. For some of us that means just us by ourselves. And so even those, right, there's variety, there's variance, there's sort of embedded within that schemata, there's too much to just make it, you know, all the same. And this, you know, so if we look at those tomatoes too, right? Like if I apply another language to this, right? They're not tomatoes at all, they're tomates, right? Like if I speak in Spanish, these aren't tomatoes. They're, you know, they're something else. And so when we have that added element of, well, if there are hundreds of different languages and this thing that stays what it is, regardless of what we call it, is called 100, you know, 300, 400 different things, depending on which language you're looking at, how is that real, right? The name of the thing itself changes. So it's like, there's, like I said, there's all this kind of like mess and slippage, but we are so arrogant as human beings that this is what Nietzsche would say, right? That we say, no, that is truth. Like, because I've classified this thing, it's truth. And Nietzsche says, you're fooling yourself, human, by thinking that way. So, you know, I have a slightly different version. So I'm going to try and read to the best of my ability some of these quotes from Nietzsche, because I think they're important, right? The first one in the second edition, I don't have the third edition on me. I always keep the second. I keep that MF second edition thing on me. I know I'm such a dork. It's on page 768. It's about about 4.5 pages into the reading, still under section 1. Nietzsche says, what then is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonymies, anthropomorphisms, in short, a sum of human relations which have been subjected to poetic and rhetorical intensification, translation, and decoration, and which, after they've been in use for a long time, strike a people as firmly established, canonical, and binding. There's that word canon again. Truths are illusions of which we have forgotten that they are illusions, metaphors which have become worn by frequent use and have lost all sensuous vigor, meaning the senses. Coins, which having lost their stamp, are now regarded as metal and no longer as coins. Yet we still do not know where the drive to truth comes from, okay? So what is it, right? He's still 5 pages in going, if what we've conceived to be the truth is not actually the truth, but our need to classify the world, then what's truth, right? What's truth? And he goes on to say, let's see, oh, that truths or illusions are part of that second quote, right? But think about this, right? This is exactly the stuff we're talking about, right? Truth is illusion, right? That is, that's terrifying, Because what that says is this thing that we've always considered to be, you know, in its little space is the exact opposite of what it actually is. So in other words, our need to create truth, to stabilize our understanding of the world, to create reason and logic and all of these things, all we've been doing is creating more and more and more delusion by establishing that. And like, think about he has that great metaphor about like a building being built on a river, right? Or on water. It's like, think about how shaky that foundation becomes. Whoa, if everything we've considered to be truth, right, is not, it's just our need to sort of classify it, then what is truth? Like, this becomes kind of terrifying. So let's, take a minute to think about it if you have to. And then he continues, and he says, kind of, maybe about a half page away from that, he says, everything which distinguishes human beings from animals depends on this ability to sublimate sensuous metaphors into a schema. In other words, to dissolve an image into a concept. This is because something becomes possible in the realm of these schemata, which could never be achieved in the realm of those sensuous first impressions. Namely, the construction of a pyramidal order based on castes and degrees, the creation of a new world of laws, privileges, subordinations, definitions of borders, which now confronts the other sensuously perceived world as something firmer, more general, more familiar, more human, and hence as something regulatory and imperative. This is where we start to go, ba-boom, right? Like, oh boy. What Nietzsche is saying here, and this idea of the pyramidal order, right? This is not Nietzsche, this thing on the left or on the right here. This is, some of you may know this from Brave New World. But if we think about like the ordering of society according to alphas, betas, gammas, deltas, and epsilons, right? Like this pyramidal structure. Oops. The alphas are what is considered the intellectually superior group, right? They run the factories, they're the highest social class, they're divided into plus, minus, or double plus, right? They're the top dogs, right? Then we have the betas. They have adequate intelligence and live similarly to the alphas, but the implied message is they're slightly less smart, right? At least the kind of smart that it takes to succeed in this society. The gammas are semi-skilled workers, low-risk professionals, experts at repetitive tasks. Deltas are mass-produced, who lack individuality and tend to do menial jobs. And epsilons can't read or write. They work on desirable jobs and are referred to as semi-morons. Okay, so this is within a literary work. However, that literary work of science fiction is meant to, create what we talked about last week, an allegory of actual Western society, right? And what Nietzsche's saying is not this, but what Nietzsche says brings this idea eventually about, right? Which is, think about it this way, right? If we have to classify every single thing that we see in reality, whether it's calling a tomato, whether it's, making sure that, we say like, oh, men are like this and women are like that, and kind of enforcing this delusional gender binary, right? Whether it's looking at alphas, betas, gammas, deltas, or the rough equivalent in our society, what we've deemed that to be. What that means is we're taking all of this stuff that is artificial, that's not real in the sense of full-on truth, that we've constructed, and we're saying that it's natural. And Nietzsche is coming and going, throwing a bomb in that and going, no, right? Like, we have to interrogate everything that we think is the truth. Because what is the truth? We have to come back to that, right? What is the truth? Well, to kind of piggyback on that discussion of the pyramidal structure a little bit, right? Nietzsche presents a very anti-empiricist approach. And for those of you who aren't, familiar with empiricism, it's that notion that John Locke was a big proponent of it, that basically says, if I can see it in the tangible world, right? Like if this glass exists and I can touch it and I can feel it, I can drink out of it, right? Then there must be reality, right? There must be a tangible reality, because I can experience sensuously, meaning through my senses, the external things in this world. But Nietzsche goes, nah, right? He says, I'm imposing my reality on this thing. I'm calling this a glass. I'm putting the water that I drink out of this. This could have been, if I flip this over, it could be like, I don't know, flip it on its side, it could be like a house for bugs, right? Like if I put it upside down, maybe it's a magnifying glass. Like I'm imposing my reality on this thing. And because I'm labeling it, then maybe it's not really a glass at all. Maybe it's something else. And so this notion of correct perception is BS, right? It's fabricated by us because we've named everything. We've classified everything. We've created a natural and artificial state so that things make sense, right? If you've ever read the poem A Jar in Tennessee, that's what the whole point of that Wallace Stevens poem is. Like the brush in Tennessee is just wild, growing everywhere. And this person sets a jar to create that order out of chaos, right? To have some sort of signifying point so that the world around that jar, that's all wild brush, now can be defined by that jar so that it makes sense. Anyway, let's move on. So how do we get free? Well, we have to get away from subjectivity or seeing ourselves as the center of the universe, right? We have to stop trying to classify, stop trying to impose order by defining the world that we see. Realize that we're just animals with the ability for speech, and that we exist within and among this chaos, right? And so I don't know why I put this quote on 771, but let me go to it, right? He says, let's see. Okay, so right before we get to section 2, right? He says, so that what we find imposing is our own activity. We're the ones creating imposition. We're the ones creating things that are artificial, unnatural, untruthful, right? Of course, the consequence of this is that the artistic production of metaphor, with which every sensation begins within us, already presupposes those forms and is thus executed in them. Not only from the stability of these original forms can one explain how it is possible for an edifice of concepts to be constituted in its turn from the metaphors themselves. Again, so that's kind of the thing that we were talking about earlier with, like, we are creating the metaphors. We did all this. Like, so truth as we know it has been constructed by us. But maybe that's not the truth of a butterfly, right? Maybe that's not, like, if you've ever seen those pictures of how bees see the world and it's all in like ultraviolet blue light, what Nietzsche's saying is, like, how is that any less truthful than what we perceive the world to be? It's food for thought. So finally, he gets to this idea of, and we have a lot more that he talks about here, but he's building up to this notion of the man of reason and the man of intuition. And I feel like if you've been reading along and if you've been following this video, you can probably guess which one Nietzsche prefers, right? Which one he thinks is more truthful, right? But know that these men, right, we can call them people, but he calls them men, right? Know that they can exist within us simultaneously. In other words, it's not like some of us are men of reason, some of us are men of intuition. I mean, a lot of us aren't men at all. So, you know, but that we have both of these impulses essentially on a spectrum, right? That we could reference or cull from at any moment, right? And so if we think about the man of intuition, or maybe we can even call that person like the man of imagination, right? Why might that person understand truth better than the man of reason and therefore be more joyous, according to Nietzsche? And then he, you know, again, Nietzsche gets this reputation for being like this like real grouchy, bummer out kind of a guy. But he leaves us again with this sort of hilarious, hyperbolic visual that I love, right? He's talking about the man of reason versus the man of intuition. And he talks about, you know, the man of intuition suffers. It's not that it's all joy. And he even is unreasonable in his suffering, right, as he is in his joy. But he's not wearing a mask, right? Like the man of reason has this mask. And if, let's say, a rain cloud falls on him, right, he's still suffering, but you can see what Nietzsche calls, you know, like a twitching face, right? Yeah. And then he ends with this image of the man of reason. And I just want to read this to you. He says, how differently the same misfortune, meaning like, you know, suffering or like a big rain cloud falling on us, how differently the same misfortune is endured by the Stoic, who has learned from experience and who governs himself by means of concepts. This man, who otherwise seeks only honesty, truth, freedom from illusions, and protection from the onslaughts of things which might distract him, now performs in the midst of misfortune a masterpiece of pretense, just as the other did in the midst of happiness. He does not wear a twitching, mobile human face, like the man of intuition does, but rather a mask, as it were, with its features in dignified equilibrium, stoicism, right? Not showing any emotion. He does not shout, nor does he even change his tone of voice. If a veritable storm cloud empties itself on his head, he wraps himself in his cloak and slowly walks away from under it. So, in other words, what's more honest? The person who's freaking out because of out of nowhere, you know, like a day like 2 days ago when it was bright and sunny, a storm cloud just showed up and poured itself on us. Like, of course, the man of intuition would be like, wow, you know, I'm cold. But the man of reason just, everything's fine, gonna walk away. Which one is more honest? And so what is Nietzsche saying about language, right? What's he saying about language? These are, I know, again, these are real kind of heavy things to think about, but, and you might even be asking, I'm going to take it off stop share now. You might even be asking, like, what does this have to do with literature? A lot. Because think about the kinds of metaphors that we present in literature. Think about the kinds of things, reality-wise, that we concern ourselves with. Think about these sort of existential or universal truths that good literature is supposed to sort of guide us to. You know, and then you can start thinking about how we apply some of these theoretical concepts to those readings. We don't have to be geniuses. We don't have to be, you know, you don't have to be a Nietzsche scholar. I'm not a Nietzsche scholar. I've read a few of his things. So don't worry about that. But if any of these, if any of these ideas just like, whoa, that's a crazy idea, right? Like that's really jumping out at me. Go with it. Doesn't have to be a big idea, but you can run with that thing. I mean, people have built careers and PhDs off of running with a tiny idea from some of these things, right? The man of, like, one of my people that I enjoy. Let me see. Oops. Theorist by the name of Camille Paglia, who's still alive. Yes, I am wearing pajama pants in this. Oops, you guys saw the lack of professionalism. She talks about the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Well, what is the Apollonian and the Dionysian? It's basically the man of reason as the Apollonian, and the man of intuition is the Dionysian. So, and she's written, I don't know, 20 books that look like door stoppers on the, on concepts related to that. So if you don't think that a tiny little idea is enough to go on, you are sorely mistaken. You could make a whole career out of it if you wanted to. So just know that you don't have to know everything and all the things, and you don't have to be an expert on the things, but the stuff that sticks out to you that you're really digging and grooving with, I know I'm using super old language, start thinking about how it applies to literature. All right, so that's it for today. My dog Lionel is starting to whine at me, so I gotta go. But I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day / night, and I'll see you all in cyberspace. Okay, Lionel, relax. Bye.